So, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Frederick Gooding Jr., aka Dr. G. I am indeed the captain of my ship and the master of my destiny. Yes, Megan, that's a true story. I'm also an associate professor of African American Studies at Texas Christian University. And in studying Black history, I can't help but study the image of African Americans and how it has changed over time, or in some ways, maybe perhaps remain consistent. And that's what I'd like to talk about with you today in terms of us looking at the African American experience through the specific lens of the Academy Awards. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So for starters, I just want to be very clear that even though I am quite critical of what Hollywood has done and is doing in various respects, it doesn't mean that I hate the movies. If anything, it's quite the opposite. I absolutely love the movies and spend a lot of time with the movies because I care about the movies. And so because I spend so much time with the movies, I've made several observations, did some research, and wanted to share them with you so that way you have something to think about next time you go into the theater. And so while we're talking about movies, and this is somewhat a pleasurable affair for us to have this conversation, because what I'm going to do is spend the first 35 minutes or so sharing a few thought concepts, and then what we can do is engage with a little bit of Q&A towards the end. So feel free along the way to put questions within the chat or what have you, or you can save them to the end. But before I go any further, I just would like to acknowledge that we have the luxury and privilege of talking about movies. Unfortunately, yesterday in the state of Colorado, another travesty unfolded on our hands. And I just would like to send out my respect and just send out my respects for the families that are dealing with the aftermath of this travesty. Is something that should not happen, and I'm very sorry that it did. And so my hope is that somehow we as a society and a community are able to somehow get it right moving forward. But it was terrible. It's absolutely terrible to hear that news. And so I'm sure many in Colorado are feeling that. So just wanted to say that before we move on. So in terms of what we want to talk about with the movies today, we're going to have our conversation structured along the lines of a 3-act play, or as with most movies will follow. So there's typically an introduction where you get a chance to know the main characters and the overarching story ideas. Then you have the conflict and climax, and then you have resolution. So we plan to follow that model this evening. So, introduction. A lot of what I'm saying is not necessarily new, but a lot of it is often hidden in plain sight. And so you may have observed it, but maybe just never gave voice to it before because you just maybe didn't have to. So what we're going to do is add a new lens to your toolbox in terms of how you view African Americans in film, particularly through those are Oscar nominated and receive so much attention. And so consider this your training day. And I thought it would be appropriate to summon an Academy Award winning actor to help us with our training day initiation.
Why did you do this to me?
You're an adult, man. Shit, nobody told you to smoke that. Made a decision, live with your decision. Ain't like I put a gun to your head.
And hopefully you won't find my presence as sinister as that of the character of Alonzo Harris, as played by Denzel Washington. But what you might find sinister is that we are going to indeed have spoiler alerts, because any movie that we talk about from here on out, we're going to talk about the key plot points in order for us to be able to analyze it properly. So do be forewarned, if you haven't seen the movie before, we are going to talk about key plot points. So let's start from the very beginning. If you recall, the name of the book that you can find at your Aura public library and check it out is called Black Oscars, from Mammy to Minnie, what do the Academy Awards tell us about African Americans? So, by way of simple quiz, does anyone know who Mammy is? When you hear the word Mammy, does anyone know who that is? I mean, feel free to put an answer in the chat box or what have you. Or I don't know if we have the ability to unmute ourselves, but does anyone have any idea of who Mammy is? Well, she was indeed a movie character. And by way of hint, I'm thinking of a movie that came out in 1939, an Academy Award winning movie role, actually, that came out in 1939. And that movie role would be none other than Mammy, as played by Hattie McDaniel, right? Gone with the Wind, 1939. That was Mammy. So, in asking the question, who is Minnie? I mean, that might even be a tougher question to answer, right? I mean, who exactly was Minnie? Does Minnie ring a bell? Does anyone know who Minnie was? Well, to answer my own question, Minnie is also the name of a movie character, an Academy Award winning movie character, and it was played by none other than Octavia Spencer in the Academy Award winning movie The Help, which came out in 2011. So from the very onset, we start to frame our conversation because I think it's quite a pertinent one. What does this say about the status, the value, and visibility of African Americans in our society if they're still winning roles for playing maids on screen over 70 years apart? 70, right? 7 decades. What does that say? So that's what we want to interrogate in this conversation. So some of you by now might be thinking, well, what's the big deal? I mean, Dr. G, I mean, it's just a movie, right? I mean, the Oscars, I mean, what's the big deal? Well, it may not be a big deal to you, but that doesn't mean it's not a big deal. The Oscars just happen to be the second most watched television program on the planet, behind the Super Bowl, that is. So we're talking about a 30-second ad might run you anywhere in the range of $3 to $5 million. Right. So over 255 countries are tuned in to the Academy Awards. So even though you may not think much of it and you may not tune in, there's an international audience of millions, hundreds of millions that are tuning in and are watching. And so it just begs the question, what are people seeing when they're tuning in? So a lot of what I'm talking about today is actually derived from an earlier book that I wrote. It's entitled,
You Mean There's Race in My Movie?
Oh my God.
But there's no need to panic. The character patterns that I found are rooted in that first book. But in terms of tonight's conversation, what we want to talk about are how the consistent pattern of Oscar nominations has also been made apparent and manifest based upon my research. And so what's fascinating is that if you look at the base of an Academy Award, you'll find that there are 5 small circles. Many of us don't see these circles when people hold up their Oscars up high in celebratory fashion. But when I had the good fortune to visit the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences while conducting research for this book, I actually had that opportunity to hold an Oscar in my hand. And then looking at it, I asked, well, what are these circles? What's this about? And that's when I learned that those 5 circles represent the 5 original branches of filmmaking. And so I use this as a means for fashioning a rubric for what I call the 5 Black Oscar angles. And I will explain what they are in a bit more detail. But these are the 5 angles, just as a preview, if you would. And I'll explain their significance in terms of why we should use them as a tool in looking at Black Oscar nominations or wins. Also, what I'll do is I'll be sure to provide you with statistical data that shows us to what degree African Americans have been included or not with respect to our biggest show on earth. So those are the nominations. These are the ones. I'll be sure to share this with you before our time is up. But for now, what I would like to do is simply just put out some thought concepts on the table in terms of when we look at these Oscar roles, because again, what my book does is it doesn't necessarily chronicle the actual actors themselves, right? I'm not, I mean, God bless them, but I'm not interested in where they grew up and where they learned and got their acting chops. I'm actually interested in the role they play on screen and what's the value of that role and how is that role interacting with other characters on screen, right? You know, what's the symbology from that message? What's the visual iconography, right, that we can interpret? And so, in addition to the quantity, right, because I think quantity is a viable means of measurement, but it's in many ways crude. I mean, numbers only tell a part of the story. So, in addition to the quantity, I suggest that we measure the quality of the roles. And so, to help us along, I selected 3 recent but related movies that were indeed Academy Award nominated or wins that will help us frame this discussion about quality before we get to the Black Oscar angles and the actual data. So first up, oh wait, what did I miss? Let me think.
So what did I miss? What did I miss?
Oh, that's what I missed. One little detail that we should review before we get into the actual qualitative examples is that Hollywood started off with this thing called racism. I know it sounds a bit awkward to say or even hear, but then again, those are the facts. After all, if I were to ask you, well, what's the first mainstream movie? What is considered to be the archetype, the godfather, the godmother of all mainstream movies in terms of its cinematography and its style and the pacing and the storyline, the way it was put together in contrast to the talking pictures of old? Does anyone know the name of this movie? Well, I happen to know the name of it. It's entitled Birth of a Nation. And because it's so historically significant, this movie is still screened in movie schools and movie programs, film programs all across the country still today because of its historical significance. But what makes me so strident in my assertion that it's racist? Well, here's the storyline. The storyline is, as you can tell by the movie poster, the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, which means Band of Brothers. This was a group of jilted Confederate soldiers who were founded in roughly 1866 after the Civil War, who wanted to restore order to society. And so what they've done is over the years, they've engaged in a number of domestic terroristic acts, including bombing of churches and killing of people, that they didn't feel met the standards of the pristine white race, right? So that's the KKK for you. And, despite the fact that they've adopted a couple of highways, don't let the smooth taste fool you, they've engaged in quite heinous acts against humanity. And so literally the plot of this movie is the KKK rides in on the horses to save a white damsel in distress from a black man, not a black man, but a white man in blackface. So that's a byproduct of the minstrel era, when white males particularly would darken their face with burnt cork or shoe polish, and then they would exaggerate or imitate what they thought was the actions and mannerisms of black people. So in other words, many a white audience drew merriment and entertainment and pleasure from this idea that we were making fun of black people. So yes, Birth of a Nation is racist. But let's not stop there. What if I were to ask you, what's the first ever talking picture? The first ever movie that was synchronized. Many of these are fans of Singing in the Rain. That was part of the shtick, the inside, joke, this idea of the talking picture versus synchronizing sound with visual. Does anyone know the name of the first talking picture? Well, yes, that would be The Jazz Singer in 1927, starring Al Jolson. And again, the storyline is white male who his family wanted him to be a cantor, meaning that he was supposed to sing the Torah as part of religious ceremony. He did not feel that necessarily fit his talents. He wanted to make it in show business, and he wanted to be a minstrel singer. And as you see by the picture, that is him with the white gloves on, face painted in black, as I was mentioning earlier. And the white around his mouth is supposed to be the enlarged size of black lips, right? Bear that idea of black lips in mind. We'll come back to that a little bit later in the program. So that too is racist. So that's how Hollywood began, right? That's how Hollywood began. And so we have to ask ourselves if racism was a train that left, let's say, in 1915 from the Hollywood station, when exactly was it derailed, right? And so as we're going through these clips, what I want you to have in the back of your mind is this idea of, has racism evaporated over time because we see less of the KKK, or has it evolved in some ways in terms of us still getting to the same destination in terms of this idea that Black is still just not as valuable as anything else we see on the screen? Just something for you to think about in the back of your head. And I love to debate about it or take questions on it afterwards. Act 2, conflict and climax. So why don't we go ahead into our qualitative analysis, and we'll start with hidden figures. Why don't you check out this clip, and it's about a minute, and just see what your reaction is. It's a very, very powerful clip. So check it out and see what your reaction is.
There you have it. No more colored restrooms. No more white restrooms. Just plain old toilets. Go wherever you damn well please. Preferably closer to your desk.
Okay. So I really would love to hear from anybody, but I'm just curious what makes this such a powerful clip. I know why I selected it and why it stood out for me. I think while I'm waiting to see if anyone responds, I think one of the pieces that jumps out to me is this idea that using the restroom is universal, right? Really, it's just a function of humanity. I think every human being on the planet has to, at some point in time, eliminate waste. And so the idea that someone has to use the restroom, that's something that we all can relate to. It really has nothing to do with race. But yet, I think what the scene points out is the illogic behind racism, right? Because racism even worked its way into the most basic of human functions, whereby we still had to be separated, right? It still boggles my mind to think about how there were these things called segregated cemeteries. Really, here we can't even decompose to dust, in the same space underground. It's just when you really think about racism, the logic behind it is just simply not there. It just doesn't stand up, right? Not to mention how damaging it is in terms of the victims and for the oppressors, as far as warping their sense of human relations. So that's one of the reasons why this clip stood out to me. But here's the catch. While this was indeed a very much powerful clip that shows the universality of our humanity and how ridiculous it is essentially to separate and segregate us in these type of ways, unfortunately, it wasn't real. This clip was completely fabricated and made up. So what does that mean? I don't know what it means, but I have several questions for you, meaning several questions such as, what does this say and what does this mean if a movie presumptively, I'm just going by the title, Hidden Figures, right? I think it was a double entendre, not just looking at the actual numbers that were crunched in the mathematical computations in order to help facilitate space travel during this space race with Russia, but also this idea that you had these hidden individuals who were overlooked in terms of the contributions, largely because they were Black and they were female. Right. And so here this movie is about these three women and augmenting and amplifying their voices. But at the same time, one of the most pivotal scenes features a white male hero that was fabricated. So I think it raises a lot of questions as to, because remember, a lot of things have to happen before a movie scene is inserted in a production of this quality and magnitude. It wasn't as if they were just rolling tape one day and said, oh, let's just keep going with it. No, it was planned out. It was it costs money. I mean, you had to schedule it. And so the question is, why did the director and the producers feel as if the stories of the Black woman were just simply not enough? Why was it necessary to fabricate this scene inserting white male heroism when there is no evidence of that having existed? So I think what this scene does is, on one level, helps shed light and bring attention to a very important issue. But at the same time, I think it raises a lot of questions as to, are you really following through with the intention of shining the spotlight on the Black voices that you intended to spotlight? How come their voices aren't strong enough? How come their identity is simply not enough? That's just something for us to think about. But let's move on to our second example. That would be The Help. So, The Help is a movie that was optioned off of a New York Times bestselling book by the same name, written by a white female. Her name is Catherine Stockett. Her claim to fame is that she was rejected roughly 60 times before her book finally caught on. And yes, boy, did it catch on. New York Times bestseller, and then optioned to this movie. So let's take a look at what Catherine Stockett had to say about this movie, or particularly the protagonist of this movie. As the readers of The Help may know, Maya Abilene is a true heroine. She's intelligent, an author, devoted servant of the Lord, and a good mother. So my question to you is, a good mother to who? For those of us who saw the movie, The Help, who do we see Abilene being a good mother to, right? Because this is what Catherine Stockett is telling us. Who is she a good mother to? I'm just trying to remember, I'm an absent-minded professor, but if I recall correctly, Abilene did indeed mention that she had a son. She was a mother, but we never saw her son on screen. In fact, we never saw her son on screen because she recanted a tragic story whereby her son was killed prematurely. We did see, however, Octavia Spencer's child on screen, right? And I think what's significant about this is she was preparing her teenage daughter for a life of, I don't know what else to call it, but servitude, right? And let's just think about how this contrasts to other movies we've seen whereby young white female or male teenagers are able to explore and discover coming of age, whether it be through fantasy or what have you, this idea of what life means to them. Just think about, how many young white kids we've seen with dinosaurs roaming all around or something of that nature, right? But yet, meanwhile, when we look at this young Black teenager, we see her being prepped by her mother for a role of servitude. So that's one aspect of the motherhood. But let's go back to Viola Davis. Abilene is the character that she played. Here's the only evidence I could find of her being a good mother in the movie. And maybe you saw something different.
You is kind, you is smart, you is important, you is smart, you is kind, you is important. Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, so that's the only motherhood that I saw, really. And, again, I think it's a fair question as far as in 2011, that is, right? If we're in the modern era, I think Obama was president during that time, right? What's so fascinating about a Black female taking care of a white family? Remember, it's a for-profit movie. It's not a documentary, might I remind our audience. It's a for-profit movie. It's not a documentary. So, I think the question is, what's so fascinating about that, right? I think what is fascinating for me is Viola Davis, actually, if there's anyone who has a voice in this, she actually regrets her role in The Help. And you can look it up, but she said that, and remember, this is before the George Floyd murder. So, we can't look to that necessarily as the impetus. But she just said, I felt at the end of the day, the voices of the maids weren't really heard, right? And when the voices of the maids were heard, I think we need to question, the agency in which they were communicated. So does anyone remember the terrible awful, right? The gag behind that terrible awful? Well, by way of spoiler alert, the terrible awful was a pie that Minnie, right, the Academy Award winning Minnie, gave as a gift to the caretaker who was quite mean. Her name is Hilly, right? So she was the source of evil in the movie, and this was her comeuppance to eat this pie. And why was it comeuppance? Well, it was comeuppance because apparently, according to Minnie, the pie, the main ingredient was fecal matter, right? And so, the joke was, let her eat my shit. Okay. So, but while I think it was viewed and intended to be humorous at the time, I just have some practical questions, such as what were the ingredients? I think we kind of reviewed that. But more importantly, how does she procure the ingredients? How does she make it? Where does she make it? What was baking like? What happened to the baking tools? So in other words, I'm asking these logical questions because I want to point out the deficiency in structuring Black female voices behind a juvenile act. I think is a bit insulting when we consider that scores of Black women actually had no choice in terms of, remember, there's this thing called discrimination. And so many Black women applied for jobs and just were flat out rejected. And so domestic work was virtually the only thing that they can do. At one point in the South, virtually 80% of all Black women were working as domestics because there was just no other place where they could get jobs. So what's fascinating is even though the era of enslavement had ended many decades prior, many Black women were still fulfilling this caretaking role as if they were in enslavement times, except they were receiving low, meager wages, as a result. And, if you're really interested in the topic, you can read the Pulitzer Prize winning book, Warmth of Other Suns, From Your Aura, Public Library by Isabel Wilkerson. She also had a new book that just came out called Caste. That's also fairly fascinating. And I think you can read more about, how these Black women were not protected by #MeToo, right? Many of these women were preyed upon in these homes and often were worked to the point of exhaustion. And I think as a result of that, so many of these Black women for so long had to be strong. And when you think of the Rosa Parks and other Black women who weren't seeking attention, but simply did whatever they could to keep their families going and be functional within their communities and their churches, the civil rights movement that we know in the 60s would not be possible were it not for many of these individuals who leveraged their agency in very creative and innovative ways before the advent of the internet, cell phones, and affordable long distance phone calls. And so I just think that, and for me, in retrospect, it just cheapens the true life agency when people were really taking shit on a daily basis. In terms of this just being part of a gag at the end of the movie. But again, let's just move on to some other piece, which is who does the movie actually concern? And again, I'll be open to any comments, and people can email me at f.gooding@tc.edu. But what I submit to you is that the movie actually wasn't about the maids at all. It actually was about the white female, Skeeter, as played by Emma Watson, because the movie that I saw featured a white female who was unsure about her career path, but she was able to somehow land a job at the newspaper. She agreed to do the advice column, but the advice column actually was her leveraging the advice of the Black maid on the right-hand side, Abilene. And then she leveraged that column into a book deal. Then she corralled the voices of the Black females and then agreed to be their sponsor. And then she leveraged that book deal into a career pathway in New York, all the while reconciling with her mother and her love life. So while there was hints of Abilene becoming a writer at the end of the movie, I didn't see it on screen. I didn't see evidence or proof of it. It was hinted. Let's also, for the record, establish that both Minnie and Abilene both were in maid outfits in their last scenes on screen. But what about Minnie? Wasn't that a glamorous picture? Wasn't that glorious? She and her mistress were sharing fried chicken cooking duties at home. Wasn't that great? Isn't that an example of racial comedy? Maybe, but I guess my question would be, who's cooking the fried chicken and cleaning the dishes the next day? So in other words, what I'm suggesting to you is the dynamic of Black female subjugation is virtually unchallenged in this movie. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, I personally don't need to see this movie because it's interesting. I don't personally need to see this movie because it's informational. It was made for profit. And all I have to do is just ask my great aunt, what was it like sitting on your knees, cleaning a toilet with a toothbrush? And so I think we need to start to ask ourselves, who are these movies made for? Like, so in other words, who does the help truly help? Speaking of starring, I just want to take a quick detour before I get to the last qualitative movie, which is The Green Book. I have similar questions about who is the object of our attention in this recent release, right? I mean, I don't know if any of you have seen the new Pixar release, Soul, just came out earlier this year, but this movie has been attracting a lot of attention because it's billed as the first animated movie to star a Black protagonist. So many of you may be thinking, oh, but what about A Princess and the Frog? Well, first of all, Princess and the Frog was done in the tradition of cell animation drawing, right? So when you think about your older Bambi's, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Beauty and the Beast, that's cell animation. So that was Princess and the Frog. And not to be funny or facetious, but if you watch the movie Princess and the Frog, the movie could possibly be retitled The Princess is the Frog, because she was a human being for all of 30 minutes of the movie. For most of the movie, she was a frog. She was disembodied. So let's move on to this movie. So I think what's fascinating is when you look at the most recent Pixar releases featuring featuring protagonists, look at Raya that just came out on the 5th of March. Look at Tangled, look at Brave. All these feature young teenagers, right? Young protagonists. I think it's fascinating that for whatever reason we deviate, and now the first Black protagonist from a Pixar movie is a 40-something-year-old middle-aged jazz middle school teacher. So that's interesting. But even more interesting is Jamie Foxx is the voice of the character, the main character. And and Jamie Foxx is what we call a crossover. I'll explain that in a few slides. He's a crossover. So in other words, he didn't start off his career as an actor per se. He actually started off as a comedian and then made his way into acting and branching off to music. But Jamie Foxx is actually the voice of the cat. Again, spoiler alert, but he dies early on in the movie. Okay, that's A. And then B is he's trying to get back to Earth and get back into his body, but I guess this being a movie of comedic proportions, he gets into the body of the cat. And Tina Fey, as voiced by white female comedian, she's now in the body of Joe Gardner. And look at the bottom. That's actually when you hear from Jamie Foxx the most in the movie, when he's in the spiritual form in the land of the great before. And what's fascinating is if you look very carefully at him, remember I was talking about lips earlier, about the minstrels, how they would exaggerate lips. The idea is that many a Black individual can attest to having been the subject of derision and scorn. This idea of large noses that flare out and large lips. This has been made fun of over the years, and also personally within my lifetime, right? In terms of how big and the lips are and things of that nature. Something that many people have made fun of over millennia, right? Well, in this country, that is. If you look at political cartoons and things of that nature, that's one of the ways to dehumanize the African American images through the size of the lips. So what's so curious to me is we fast forward a few years, and all of a sudden we have the Kim K package, we have the Kylie Jenner package, and all of a sudden it's really cute to pout lips and take selfies. For some reason, all of a sudden it's in, right? This idea of fat lips, except perhaps when it's an actual Black person. Because again, I don't know about your screen, but again, I don't have my glasses on me right now. I'm just doing this, before I have to get going. But at least right now from where I'm sitting, I can't see on my screen. I can't see any nasal features on Jamie Foxx's spiritual character, nor do I see any lips necessarily pronounced. That might. I don't know. It's just hard to see. So it's just fascinating the choices that we make. But my ultimate point about Soul is what's fascinating is in 2017, the plot line of a horror movie was Black bodies being disembodied in favor of white consciousness. And I believe that's exactly what happened in this children's movie released in 2021. How did that happen? So it's the subject of a horror movie in 2017, but yet this idea that you have a black body and is dispossessed of its own consciousness in favor of some white consciousness. And for those of you who watched the movie, Jamie Foxx learns apparently that it was he who was being selfish. And he makes the sacrifice to give up his own body up until the very, very end of the movie. Yes, he does get his body back for the record, but it was literally the last 23 seconds of the movie when he was on his way to the great beyond, right? He had made the sacrifice, he made the decision, and it wasn't until he was about to hit the light when he got pulled out of line and said, hey, you're a good dude, you can have your body back. But isn't that fascinating? This idea that a black male is selfish for wanting his own body back. But let's get back to our program. We want to talk about the Green Book. We're talking about Oscar nominees, okay? So I'm going to show you another clip that's 1 minute long. And as you're watching it, I want you to have in the back of your head this question: who is driving the action?
You shouldn't have hit him.
I didn't like the way he was treating you, making you stand out in the rain like that.
Please. You hit him because of what he called you. I've had to endure that kind of talk my entire life. You should be able to take it for at least one night.
What, I can't get mad at that stuff he was saying because I ain't black? Christ, I'm blacker than you are.
Excuse me?
You don't know shit about your own people. What they eat, how they talk, how they live. You don't even know who Little Richard is.
Oh, so knowing who Little Richard is makes you blacker than me? Oh, Tony, I wish you could hear yourself sometimes. You wouldn't talk so damn much.
Bullshit. I know exactly who I am. I'm the guy who lived in the same neighborhood in the Bronx my entire life with my mother, my father, my brother, and now my wife and kids. That's it. That's who I am. I'm the asshole who has to hustle every goddamn day to put food on the table. You, Mr. Big Shot, you live on top of a castle, traveling around the world doing concerts for rich people. I live on the streets. You sit on a throne. So yeah, my world is way more blacker than yours.
Okay, so I think what we're getting at is that Mahershala Ali won an Oscar because he was lectured by a middle-aged white male over the fact that the middle-aged white male was blacker than he was. I think that's what I just. I think that's what I just heard. I mean, just party people again. Feel free to email me your Q&A, but I'm just trying to imagine a scenario where the opposite would hold water. I mean, right? I'm just trying, and I'm having difficulty. But some of us might be itching and scratching in our seats about, well, Dr. G. At the same time, Dr. Shirley, the character played by Mahershala Ali, the black male, he was in charge. I mean, after all, the white male is driving him around. It's funny you mention that because as you see by the picture on the screen, at the very end of the movie, that power dynamic was reversed. It is actually the black male who's driving Tony home, right? Dr. Shirley's driving Tony home. And again, similar question that we had with The Help and Soul, as far as who's this movie really about. If you saw the movie, the climactic scene arguably is when Dr. Shirley, the black male, goes to Tony's home for the holidays, right? And, and remember, Tony and his wife were able to reconcile with the aid and help and assistance of Dr. Shirley with the love letters. And so, I mean, I think a fair argument can be made that even though the movie was about the black male character and his unique experience, it also was very much about the white male in terms of driving the action. Resolution. So what, right? So what does all this mean? Well, before I unveil the data from the Oscar nominees and wins, and before I talk a bit more in depth about the Black Oscar angles, I just want to just point out 3 quick points. Yes, point out 3 quick points. I used the word twice. The idea that we should not overlook that Hollywood is a significant big business, as in it's roughly $150 million on average to produce a mainstream movie. Costs can exceed that, of course. When you talk about some of the larger items, such as like Avatar or what have you, production costs can go upwards of $250 million and higher. And also, let's not overlook the $30 million it takes on average to market and promote a movie. Movie ads are ubiquitous. Let's not overlook from bus stations to fast food tie-ins, and this is one of my favorites. This is at the Bay Area Rapid Transit Station out in California. Look at what they did to the floor to make it look like the ocean. You look what they did to the ceiling to make it look like the sky. All for Pirates of the Caribbean Part 14, right? And let's not also overlook that Hollywood has a global impact. Hollywood movies are the second leading export behind aircraft, right? And so even though you may not have been to Vietnam, our American movies have been. Even though you may not have been to Australia, our American movies have been. Even though you may not have been to the Czech Republic, our American movies have been. And not to humble brag, but I've been to all three places I just mentioned. And going to their theaters is fascinating as how there's actually more American movies in these theaters than there are local movies from local industries, right? And so finally, I just want to point out that film is forever. At least that's what Angela Bassett said when she turned down the role to Monsters Ball, the Academy-winning role from the Halle Berry. And so the shelf life of movies is unparalleled compared to television shows or newspapers or magazines. And so film definitely has a cultural impact. I mean, think about how the Miracle on 34th Street, this movie still, has been on every single year since 1947. Think about how many generations are now connected by this singular image. It's not as if you saw a different version than I did. We all saw the exact same movie. And so it's almost as if, even though we had different lives, we had the same memory of this movie, right? And that's what can be the basis of a common language. Quite fascinating if you think about it. And what does that mean when it comes to some of these images about race, particularly if many images of Black, Indigenous people of color are absent, or if they're present, they're marginalized. So let's get to our final Oscars analysis. As you can see, there unfortunately is not much to discuss here when it comes to the raw numbers. I mean, again, I don't know what you just want me to do, but there's not much to talk about when you see 0.6% out of 451 nominees over a 91-year period. There's just really not that much to talk about. Similar with the Black Oscar wins. I mean, when you're talking about over the whole course of the 91 years, of course, this might change this year on April 25th, but as of now, I mean, we've only had one Black female Best Actor winner ever, Best Actress winner ever, 0.2%. I mean, I just don't know if there's that much to talk about there, right? So I think we all knew that the numbers would be low, but this is how low they really are. But here's what I'm more interested in sharing with you, right? As a result of my research, I talked about those Black Oscar angles as a way to frame how we look at these nominees and roles. So here's the deal. When it comes to Black non-American, nearly a fifth of all Academy nominated Black Oscar roles were of individuals who were not from America. It's not to shame these individuals. I'm very happy that these individuals are working and are making progress with their career. But at the same time, it's just raises the question as to how difficult is it for African Americans to gain traction in Hollywood. So in other words, think of the movie Harriet. The leading role is played by Cynthia Erivo. I mean, you mean to tell me that Harriet Tubman, right? Harriet Tubman, an African American, an American heroine who literally took people to freedom and safety over the border to Canada. You can't find anyone walking the streets of Los Angeles. I mean, there's no Black woman walking the streets of Los Angeles who are looking to break into the industry who would be able to play this role. So again, what it does is we're not taking away from the people from the UK or any other destinations of the Caribbean or from the motherland of Africa. We're not taking away from them. We're just actually pointing a finger at more at Hollywood. This idea that, what are you doing to make sure that there's opportunity for people in your own backyard? Similarly with crossover, we see how nearly a third of all your Black movie stars are not necessarily Black movie actors. And yet, as I referenced earlier, we often overlook how so many, with Jamie Foxx, how so many of these Black movie stars are crossover comedians or musicians. And again, what does that say about the paucity of true opportunity? So in other words, I have to have a platinum selling album in order for Hollywood to take me seriously and land me a bit role. I mean, think about Ludacris and Tyrese in the Fast and Furious series, right? And still they're in the series, but they still have bit roles. It's not like they're starring and commanding or anything of that nature, but it just really places a heavy premium. I mean, because think about someone like Tom Cruise. He didn't jump out of the womb as an A-list actor. Yes, he's been known to jump on couches during talk shows late at night, but he didn't jump out the womb as an A-list actor. He was built up over time. And so the question is, to what degree is Hollywood similarly investing time and resources into building up additional people for us to enjoy, right? You know, whether black, white, or whoever. Okay. Deja vu refers to what you saw on a smaller scale. Think about it. I chose 3 movies, and of those 3 movies, two of the movies featured the same actress, as in Octavia Spencer, right? And so, wow, I mean, 40% have been nominated before, you know, or so in other words, it's not as if of all the winners or nominees, there've been different people all across time. No, it's really the same small club of people. Again, speaking to this idea of paucity of opportunity. So I say all this to say, God help us, if Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, and Viola Davis all get into a car accident, that would literally be half of our nominations. With respect to gravity of reality, I think what's fascinating about this is in terms of helping us judge the quality of these roles, 80% of all the Academy Award Black Oscar nominees were in movies or roles whereby they were battling with poverty or racism, poverty or racism, poverty or racism. This is the gravity of reality. And again, in contrast, remember what I was speculating earlier about, oh, what about white teenagers just being in a world of dinosaurs, something random like that, right? That's called, so in other words, many of our white characters are liberated by what we call the freedom of fantasy on screen. Meanwhile, with our black characters, it's about poverty or racism. And if you look at the black nominees for this year, I think you'll find that many of these nominees fulfill this pattern, right? In terms of, not to say they can't be riveting performances, it's not to say that they're touching, but for many of us, after working, Monday through Friday, on Friday night, we're looking for an escape, for a release. And, for many of these movies that feature these black nominees, it's almost as if you have to get emotionally prepared, to deal with some of the material, right? Not to say that it's not good acting or quality of production, but it's just a completely different vein. And
the power of imagination, the thrill of adventure. The journey will be electric. The Chevy Bolt.
Okay, you get the point. Meaning that when I talk about my white brothers and sisters enjoying the freedom of fantasy, being liberated by the freedom of fantasy, you just saw how in this simple commercial, how there's an X-Wing fighter, A, flying that close to the ground, no. B, really? I mean, the Chevy Bolt, is that powerful? Is going into hyperspace? That's fantasy. But we see this all the time and don't think anything of it. Just now what I want you to think about is how many times have you seen, African Americans, in these other type of roles where it's just dealing with fantasy, right? And then finally, we're still in the struggle. Nearly a quarter of all Black Academy Award nominees died in the course of the movie. So as we wrap up here, I just simply want us to ask the questions of, well, which one is it, right? Because when speaking of fantasy, this is a still from the movie Ted. That is a creation of Seth MacFarlane, the author of the Family Guy series on TV, the animated series. And it was a flip, right, on the idea of the cuddly teddy bear that everybody gets, when they're a kid, they're so cuddly and whatnot. But the idea is Ted was this foul-mouthed Bostonian, right? And so it was meant to be funny. He's walking around, he's crude, he's doing all these sorts of things that even some of us adults don't do. And so unfortunately for him, spoiler alert, he gets ripped apart based upon the owner having an argument with his girlfriend about Ted is more important than me, and I'm your girlfriend. So the girlfriend, as played by Mila Kunis, she feels remorseful and looks up to the sky and wishes that Ted comes back to life. Remember, it's fantasy, it's a movie. He does fantasy, it's a movie. But even better, when she looks up at the sky, according to astronomers from a place in New Jersey called Princeton, they have verified that that was a true, indeed correct constellation of Ursa Minor. Get it? Ursa Minor means small bear. So which one is it? On one level, we're so detail oriented where for a few seconds on screen, we're able to detect Ursa Minor. Whereas then on the same side, we have no idea what's happening with the quality of these roles. I mean, look, I don't know about y'all, but I'm in the state of Texas, but I mean, I'll be hard pressed to find the Big Dipper right about now, let alone Orion's Belt and all this good stuff. And you're talking about Ursa Minor? Really, you're that detail oriented. Ursa Minor. But yeah, no idea what's happening with the quality of these roles. So speaking of which, I just want you to take a quick survey. These are the faces of all 19 Academy Award winners over the 91 years, right? Isn't that fascinating that over 91 years that I'm able to fit on one page all the winners that ever walked the earth in terms of winners, right? Winners. There were 77 total nominees, but this is it. And as you scan these pictures, I mean, think about the movies, think about the roles that they played, and start to ask yourself, to what degree have any of these roles truly challenged the status quo, right? This idea that Blacks, have always had to counter this narrative of inferiority, going back to 1619, right? That's when the first recorded ship contained enslaved individuals came over to Jamestown, Virginia. And so this idea that Blacks were inferior was part of the mental framework that helped keep the system in place, because people saw other people as humans. You're only asking humans to do what a human can do. You didn't ask the horse to come on in and sweep underneath the table. You didn't ask the cow to empty the bed pot chamber. You didn't ask the cow or the horse to do that. No, you're asking a human to do things that only a human can do. But yet at the same time, psychologically, there was a series of artifices whereby people had to believe that Blacks truly were inferior. Although, based upon the behaviors of many an owner who tiptoed into the quarters late at midnight, perhaps deep down secretly inside, many felt the opposite. That's another topic for another time. And if you don't believe me, you can look at Monticello. The name is Sally Hemings, and see her connection relationship to Thomas Jefferson, our great founding father, and founding father in more ways than one. Back to the program, I digress. The point is, to what degree has this narrative that Blacks are simply less than, to what degree has that been challenged in any substantive way? That's what we want to ask ourselves through these movies over time. So in closing, speaking of fantasy, I think there is example of fantasy all around us. And if many of you saw Jurassic World, it was absolutely fascinating, right? This idea of these two young white kids in this rotating gyrosphere, while the aura and the wonder of watching dinosaurs, roam all around them. That was brought to our screens and we loved it, right? But what's fascinating is how the creators had to see past this reality in your right-hand corner. There is no such thing as a rotating gyrosphere that we know of. And so as far as we know, I'm not sure about cloning technology, the latest updates, but we don't have a park with dinosaurs roaming all around. And so the idea is that fantasy was created. Remember, freedom of fantasy. So in contrast, we simply have to ask ourselves, what is it that we see when it comes to African-American images, and to what degree have they been grounded by the gravity of reality? So we come to the end. This is my last slide. I'm just glad to be a part of this conversation where we're thinking about what we think we know and what is arguably hidden in plain sight. Because one place where I feel that we all are equal is at the box office. Hollywood will take all of our money just the same. But it appears to me, Dr. G, that even though we pay the same price of admission, it is people of color, Blacks in particular, who disproportionately bear the cost of omission. My name is Dr. Frederick Gooding Jr., AKA Dr. G, and now that you've had this Black Oscars experience, may you never see movies the same way again. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much to Dr. G for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and drop a couple links in the chat. One of them will be the link to the Aurora Public Library catalog, where you can find Dr. G's book to check out. I'm also going to drop the link from his publisher if you are interested in purchasing a copy of the book. Also wanted to give a quick shout out to Landy A, who is watching on Facebook, who correctly identified the title of Birth of the Nation, although I did not see that fast enough to interject. So yay, props to you. So if you hang out for just a second, I'm going to drop some of those links in the chat. I will also drop my email address in the chat as well.
Okay.
Feel free to give us any questions. I will be on Facebook for just a minute here. We'll wait and see if anyone has any questions they would rather type than speak.
Sure. And you know what, Megan, I'll also drop my email as well, in case anyone has to follow up or, they feel more comfortable asking a question in private. So, and also I put in a link to what's called a landing site. I'm not sure exactly what, but I might build upon this over the summer. I've been doing this tour for some time now, and many have been asking, well, what's next? What are you going to do next? And so if people are interested in continuing the conversation, that's one way in which we can stay connected possibly.
Thank you.